When I was a toddler, my parents, a young couple in their 20s, moved out of Chicago to the suburbs because they said that housing was cheaper. One thing I remember about growing up is that they were very good about going back to Chicago frequently to visit family and friends. The drive was at least 45 minutes, often an hour with traffic. But my parents made the odd choice of sticking with all of our doctors and our dentists in Chicago. That seemed like an awful lot of driving just to go see a doctor when they could have just seen a doctor in the town where we moved. But after a while, I realized that they kept on going to Chicago because it was an excuse to visit people. They didn't want to abandon those relationships. One of the people we visited was a woman in her late 70s by the name of Stella. Stella was a Swedish immigrant and a widow. She wasn't related, even though we're Swedish. And my best guess was that she was somebody that they knew from church or something. You would think that most folks in their mid-20s with kids and jobs wouldn't bother driving an hour each way through traffic to visit an elderly widow who wasn't a relative. But we visited Stella all the time. My little brother and I loved visiting her because she was such a great host and such an interesting person. She lived in a small apartment on the north side of the city, which is the side we were from. Every time we visited her, my brother and I could count on 3 things that Stella would have ready for us. First, she would have this really tasty orange drink. It was probably the forerunner of Sunny Delight. My mom didn't buy any of that stuff, so we looked forward to getting it at Stella's house. The second thing was Stella's famous Swedish potato sausage. It was the greatest. Now, I'm from Chicago, and in Chicago, we're pretty proud of our Polish and Italian sausage. But my brother and I really thought Stella had a winner with that Swedish potato sausage. It didn't taste like anything else we'd ever tasted. The last thing that she always had for us was something called rusks. They were hard-baked, seasoned pieces of bread. They were crunchy, and they were tasty, and we'd eat every last one she had in the house because they were homemade. And now that might not have seemed like much to most people, but the fact that she was always ready to host us when we came really said a lot about how much she loved us. It was also a good opportunity for my folks to let somebody else absorb our childish energy. As I look back on that now, it's amazing just how powerful the simple act of hospitality is. Now, today's Bible passage from the Gospel of Matthew speaks about the issue of hospitality. We usually think of hospitality as a question of manners and social customs. But there are many places in the Bible which describe the importance and value of hospitality in terms of godliness. In the book of Genesis, the issue of hospitality arises when God comes to visit both Abraham and his nephew Lot. Their hospitality becomes an issue of faith because God has important messages for each one of them that God delivers only because they welcome God into their homes. The entire letter of 3 John is devoted to the question of whether or not the church should offer hospitality to visiting missionaries. That same issue is raised repeatedly in the Gospel of Matthew. This morning, I want to look more closely at this passage and suggest some lessons that we can learn about the importance of hospitality and its role in the life of the church. This passage is part of a larger section where Jesus, having trained and equipped his disciples, sends them out to do the same thing that he has been doing. He figures he can get more done in less time if he can get his disciples to shoulder some of the load. He says, I only want you to go to the people of Israel, nowhere else. And he gives them instructions to cure sick people, to raise the dead, to cast demons out of people who were possessed. And they were supposed to tell the people that they were doing this because God had taken over the reins of the world again. I know, Was there ever a time when God didn't reign over the earth? Most of us think not. But there was a sense, especially among the Jews at that time, that God had given up, or maybe had abandoned them. When they saw somebody sick, when they saw somebody die, when they met somebody who they considered to be demon-possessed, they thought it was because God was no longer in control. How can somebody who belonged to God's own people be demon-possessed through no fault of their own? When these 12 disciples went from town to town and they cast demons out of people and they healed illnesses in Matthew, it was proof to people that God was really in charge. It was like God was taking the world back again through Jesus. Jesus says that when his disciples go to a particular town and do their ministry, they should find somebody who will welcome them into their house. The disciples should accept that hospitality graciously and ask God to bless the home of their host. Now, you would think that people who went from town to town, healing the locals and casting out demons without charging, would be rather well received. You know what medical care costs these days. Can you imagine somebody who would heal you instantly for free? That person would be hounded every day. Jesus told them that they would not always receive that kind of a response. In fact, since they were doing this in Jesus' name, and since some people really had some serious disagreements with Jesus, they would be rejected from time to time just as he was, even if they were just doing good. Now, when you read this particular section of chapter 10, it's clear that Matthew is not just talking about Jesus' instruction to his disciples. He's also writing for people who lived generations after Jesus, people who themselves were rejected for telling people the good news of Jesus. He mentions that his followers will be arrested. They'll be put on trial. I guess no good deed goes unpunished. He says that if some folks treated him badly, why, they'll also treat his followers badly too, probably even worse. He tells them that their families will not be supportive of what they're doing. The choice to follow Jesus will create divisions in a family, pitting sons against parents and parents against the daughters. They shouldn't be surprised when this happens. He ends by talking about the people who will host these traveling disciples. He says something that you will read in a couple of other places in Matthew. Those who take care of folks when they come into town will be blessed as though they took care of Jesus himself. This is where the issue of hospitality goes from being a question of good manners to being one of faith. Many people at the time considered Jesus to be a prophet. The Old Testament has many stories of people who took care of traveling Israelite prophets, and they were blessed in return. In 1st and 2nd Kings, you read stories about people who housed prophets like Elijah and Elisha. In one case, a woman who was about to starve to death was blessed with enough food to keep her and her son alive. In 2 other cases, those prophets brought the dead sons of their widowed hosts back to life. Matthew is saying to his readers, hey, if you thought those women were rewarded for showing hospitality to prophets, just imagine the reward if you host one of Jesus' followers. You read the same thing in other places in Matthew. In chapter 25, we have this famous parable of the sheep and the goats, where Jesus talks about being hungry and sick and in prison. It's obvious that he's not really talking about himself. He says that when somebody takes care of one of his followers who are hungry or sick or in prison, it's like they took care of Jesus himself. Now, that passage is often misinterpreted as a reference to taking care of all of the poor of the world. But it's actually speaking about those who show hospitality to Jesus' followers as they're out spreading the word that God is taking back the world. Now, if we take this passage seriously, it really says something important to us about this issue of hospitality. We have a hospitality committee at our church. most churches do. They make sure that we have, the coffee and the goodies after worship service on Sunday. That's important because we want to make people who visit our church feel welcome here. We want to create an atmosphere where people can feel safe to share their hurts and support one another. For my own part, it really helps me because I'm a hopeless coffee junkie, and it helps me stay lucid through the Sunday school hour. But hospitality is much more than what we do between 10:30 and 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. It is rooted in the way that we view people in general. Most people are aware that showing hospitality to strangers can be risky business. We wouldn't let a stranger come into our home and stay. How do we know that we'll be safe? How do we know that we won't be taken advantage of? We are right to be cautious and suspicious of welcoming strangers. We all know people who have erred on the side of being a little bit too trusting, and they paid the price for it. But hospitality is not limited to welcoming people into your home. It also affects many of the other things that we do. And this passage reminds us how important those tasks are. Last Sunday, our congregation did a great job of modeling holy hospitality when we served a meal called Loaves and Fishes to the needy of our town. Now, we've done this dozens and dozens of times before, but what struck me this last time was just how hungry some of those folks were. We served 70 people, but we served up a total of 115 trays. That means lots of people loaded up their tray with food, gulped it down, and then went back up and filled their tray up again. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't even eat like that at an all-you-can-eat buffet. But I also know where my next meal is coming from. Imagine what it would be like to be so down and out that you're only going to get a few good meals every week. It's hard for most of us to conceive of. But think of what it means for these folks to know that the churches in town are going to donate, cook, and serve 2 meals every week to make sure that nobody goes hungry around here. Think of what that says about the people of our community. And most importantly, what kind of statement that makes about God. Last week, we served a tray of hot food, some barbecue beef, scalloped potatoes, some beans, a little fruit salad. Just the act of one of us handing a tray to somebody says, there is a God out there. You may not feel really close to that God right now, but God wants to reach out to you the way that I'm reaching out to hand you this tray. I know, we never realize what a theological statement we make when we organize these meals, right? We thought that we were just making sure somebody got a hot meal. But we're really saying something important about our faith. The other thing I want to point out about this passage is just how vital hospitality is to the work of carrying out the gospel. Matthew includes these instructions because he knows that those who are involved in doing special kinds of ministry, especially in places outside of their area, cannot do that ministry without others who engage in the ministry of hospitality. Now that may not seem like a big thing, but a little hospitality goes a long way toward enabling people to follow their calling in very real and vital ways. Let me give you a couple examples. Back in 1988, my wife and I toured Europe with our college choir. I want you to think of what a 5-week tour of Europe would cost. We had a group of 53 people, and we did 37 concerts in 35 days. We toured 6 countries, including one communist country, Hungary. You might ask yourself, how can 53 college students pay for 5 weeks in Europe, even if they're going to be singing God's praises? What kind of fundraising would you have to do? Well, the answer was not much. The whole tour cost each one of us a grand total of $600, including our plane ticket. How did we pull that off, you ask? Simple. Hospitality. In each place we performed, the local church found volunteers to host each of us in their homes. Since we were paired up, there were about 25 to 27 homes needed each night. The only place where we had to stay in hotels was in Hungary, because Hungary was still communist back in 1988, and the government didn't want us bringing talk of democracy and religion to the people. They were also required, our hosts were, to give us sack lunches in the morning so that we didn't have to buy food. Did I mention that they eat raw bacon and lots of head cheese for lunch in Europe? It was tough, but I tell you, I wouldn't have traded that experience for the world. My point is that both our lives and the lives of the people at those concerts were changed through the simple act of hospitality. When we were playing in Hungary, the churches were stuffed to capacity, and there were people standing outside looking in the windows. We never had that problem in the U.S. Let me give you another example. The first time I went on a mission trip to the Dominican Republic, it was a survey tour with a group of pastors from upstate New York. One of the stops was a tiny little town called Los Toros, named after these wild bulls that roamed the hills outside of town. We met the pastor of the church, whose name was Flor, means flower in Spanish, and she introduced us to everybody and told us what was happening in her ministry. The pastor who connected us up with Flor was named Marino Mendez. He had been doing mission work out there and had been doing some other mission work in even more remote places. There wasn't a hotel out there, so Marino simply went from door to door, asking people that he knew if they could host a couple of Americans for the night. It didn't take him more than about 15 minutes before he had homes and beds for all of us. I and my roommate, a pastor by the name of Jay, stayed in a place that looked like a glorified lean-to. I have no doubt that it was destroyed in the hurricane that they had that next spring. I remember talking with the owner and his son. His son had some kind of speech impediment. I think the owner's name was Silvio. He had a one-legged chicken in the house, who, by the way, you could not pet without getting pecked at. They gave us their beds to sleep in. It didn't feel like much of a mattress, but I was glad to have a comfortable place to lay down. The bathroom was this shed out back, and you had to fill up the commode with a garden hose that they had back there. I knew this was a real imposition for these folks because they were poor. But his hospitality changed my perspective on the world. I had never really understood third world poverty until then. I had seen the pictures, and obviously it's sad to see pictures of people living in these places, but unless you sit in their homes and eat food with them, and see the extension cords strung across their apartments, and see the tobacco drying on the clothesline out back, it never really clicks for you. That happened to me because this little town of very poor people opened their hearts and lives to us and showed us holy hospitality. All of us pastors went back to our congregations as changed people. We preached differently after that. We thought about missions differently after that. We thought about poverty in the U.S. differently. We thought about international politics differently. We even thought about our faith differently. That all happened because of the power of hospitality. It changes lives. It can be the catalyst for incredible work on God's behalf. But more than anything, it is an act of worship. Because as Jesus tells his disciples, when you did it to the least of these, my disciples, you did it unto me.